Hello there, my name is James Smith from Providence Wealth Advisory Group. I recently had the pleasure of the company of Peter Winneke, a more than 20-year veteran of the Australian philanthropic space, and he recently also wrote a book called Give While You Live. We had a fascinating discussion talking about his journey within the philanthropic space, but also some handy advice on any families and individuals that may be thinking about creating their own foundation or perhaps getting more involved within the philanthropic space. I hope you enjoy the discussion.
Peter, could you tell us, how did you get involved in philanthropy in the first place?
I think like a lot of people, James, I had no idea what I wanted to do when I was younger. I fell into commerce. I fell into 8 years insolvency at Arthur Andersen. I fell into 8 years of acquisitions at a listed media company. Enjoyed all of that, learned a lot. I didn't get married until nearly 40, so spent a lot of my life. I've travelled a lot and based in Melbourne primarily, but I wanted to get out of the Melbourne winter. So I did a lot of backpacking in the Melbourne winter for about a month every year, mainly getting off the beaten track to low to middle income countries. And I could see the inequality, and I could see examples of philanthropy having a positive impact on that growing inequality around the world. So I came back from another trip and thought I need to take some action. I think I need a bit more purpose in my life. So I sort of stumbled into the philanthropic sector about 22 years ago.
And with regards to the culture of giving in Australia, I mean, many would argue, and you talk about it in your book, that we're quite premature relative to other countries. Could you just talk about the culture of giving in Australia?
It's not, being frank, James, it's not strong, particularly amongst high net worth families. That doesn't surprise me because, as you know, most of the wealth in this country has been created just in the last 3 to 4 decades. So we're yet to build up a strong cultural giving. I'm optimistic that will occur. But there is a lot of evidence that would suggest that currently our giving levels are quite low compared to other countries.
And with regards to, you've been involved in creating more than 100 foundations in Australia, mostly for high net worth families. Just what's your view, or if you were to say, what's your guide for families that are thinking about using philanthropy as a pathway for their family?
I think one of the issues we don't talk about much in Australia, James, which has impacted the growth of the philanthropic sector, is the extraordinary educational tool that a family foundation can be for the next generation. A family foundation is a microcosm of a business. It just happens to be in the business of grant making and possibly impact investing for social good. So there's a vehicle, get the kids engaged day one. Whether you're putting $50,000 into a sub fund or 1 million, 2 million, 20 million into something like a private ancillary fund, it's got finite resources. So the first thing the kids are learning about, talking to individuals like you, experts in the field around an investment strategy. So great learnings for the kids day one. And then it's, okay, what are we going to do with this vehicle? What's our vision? What's our mission? What's our giving strategy going to be? How are we going to implement that? How are we going to measure the impact? And then having charity executives come in and possibly pitch for what they're doing. So there are governance learnings, whether you have formal board meetings around the board table here, your families that you work with, or whether the meetings are held around the kitchen table. It's a board meeting. So there are whether the board papers are 2 pages long or 40 pages, depending on that particular meeting. It's a board meeting, minutes are taken, there are accountability. So again, lots of teachable moments for the kids.
And just from that as an educational tool, with the sort of everyone's very aware of the intergenerational wealth transfer. Are you finding with younger generations, whether it's generation 2 or possibly 3 or maybe even 4, that there's a growing requirement or a growing sense of urgency from the younger generations to be more involved?
Yeah, I do see that, James. Of course, as we know, every family's different. And we know that generalisations across generations are dangerous, but I have seen a number of cases where if we say the first generation is the wealth creator, they're the wealth creators, particularly the 2Gs, the second generation, particularly if they're in their 20s and 30s, are saying, well, that's terrific, mum and dad, we've created this surplus wealth, that's wonderful, but what are we going to do with it? Because there's a few issues out there in the world that need addressing, and perhaps we can do a bit more.
And there's been quite a few families in the last 2 to 5 years that have been incredibly generous with regards to their giving in Australia. And for many, it might appear like a bit of a once-off where they've provided significant funds for a purpose, but then it might be that's all we see. I'm just interested in your guidance to families that are considering a philanthropic gift, let's call it that, and what is the best pathway, whether it's cut a large cheque to one organisation or if you go down the foundation pathway, what are the benefits either way?
Look, I think because of the immaturity, James, of the philanthropic sector in Australia, a lot of practices are unchanged in recent decades. You can go back 4 or 5 decades. The foundations that are public about what they're doing, a lot of them will have 5 or 6 or 7 focus areas, and they're doing what I call spraying and praying. They're spraying money out there and praying that it will do well. And some of it's doing great stuff, so that's slightly harsh. But best practice is ideally pick 2 areas that the family is really passionate about. Because if you've got the passion, you're going to spend more time there, you're going to build up some more expertise, and you'll probably maximise your impact. So best practice is ideally pick 1 or 2 focus areas that the family's passionate about, and then work out who's doing the best work in that space, and then back them long term with multi-year unrestricted funding. I would guess that probably 80 to 90% of grants, philanthropic grants in Australia, are probably for 1 to 2, maybe 3 years for a project that a charity's doing. Charity CEOs are desperate for unrestricted funding. They're the experts. So work out what your focus is, what are you passionate about, who's doing the best work in that space, build up a relationship, and then trust them and back them with long-term unrestricted funding. You've got to have a conversation up front, obviously, around these organisations. What does success look like? How do you measure your impact? What are the milestones along the way? So you're not just promising a blank cheque for every year for the next 10 years. You need to see that the milestones along the way are being hit. And if you've got fewer but larger partners, you're going to build a closer relationship. So things will go off track. They're going to be more open with you around, actually, things are going off track. Here's how, and here's how we're going to get things back on track. So it'll be a more honest relationship.
And just with going back to that point you made about milestones and how a family may track their contribution and their impact, are there 1 or 2 sort of ways that you would suggest for a family that are considering putting together a foundation, or maybe, as you talked about, backing 1 or 2 areas where they're passionate about that they can, from your point of view and your experience, what are a couple of key milestone tracking ways that they can look at it?
Yeah, well, I think that's a difficult question, James. I mean, it's a good question, but it's difficult because every case is different. And whether you're working with First Nations Australians or climate change, early childhood development, whatever the case is, you've got to work out what's the best way to measure impact in that space. Firstly, you want to be having those conversations with potential partners to see how they track it. If you can see that a partner, charity, a funding partner, potential funding partner's got great potential, they're not quite measuring their impact in a way that's appropriate, you might want to bring in some assistance to help them do that. So they might be doing great work, but they're just not measuring their impact in a way that's beneficial for that organisation to grow and maximise their impact. So every case is different. I think the thing that we don't do well enough in the philanthropic sector is actually how do we measure impact? It's the so what. We're cutting cheques. We're feeling good about ourselves. We've got the family engaged, but so what? What's the impact? So we just need to have more conversations about that.
And with regards to families that are thinking about the different strategies, I noticed in your book you talked about a follow strategy, and that was just something that you referred to. Can you just explain the different strategies for me?
Yeah, I was working with one family, James, and they were working on some issues within Australia, but they were very keen to fund offshore as well. And we were thinking through, do we put on a small team of 2 or 3 smart young people to go and find some really smart social entrepreneurs in Africa who were focusing on issues like health and education? And then we came across a foundation who we knew the board quite well, and they were doing exactly this. And we loved that. So we had a trust with this other foundation because we knew them. We loved the way they went about their due diligence. And we developed what we called a follow strategy. They would present their due diligence. They were in Africa several times a year. They would present their due diligence to us. We would review that, We always had some questions around the work that they'd done. And then on most occasions, not on most occasions, we would match the work that this other foundation was doing. So it was basically, it made a lot of sense to us, rather than put on another team that was going to sort of do something similar to another team that was already in place and were well ahead of us. Why reinvent the wheel? Let's follow what they're doing.
And you mentioned in your book that the giving or the philanthropic sector from a gifting area is still quite immature in Australia. Just in your experience from what you've seen internationally with families overseas, and I mean, every family is different, so the numbers are going to be varied. But just from if there's a family that's thinking about creating a foundation, or as you mentioned, investing perhaps in a sub fund of a public ancillary fund, which allows for a smaller amount.
Correct.
If a family's thinking about what's the right number, again, it's a bit of a black box.
Yeah.
Just your guidance on that.
Yeah, that's a difficult one, James. Because again, every family's different. The level of wealth is different. I think that the starting point is, I don't think we have a lot of families in Australia actually thinking through these issues around sort of how much is enough. I've worked with families who've pulled out the Excel spreadsheet and worked it. They've obviously got surplus wealth. They knew that. They thought, well, let's work out how much do we need. We own our home. We've got our holiday house. We've got our boat. We need to pay for the kids' tertiary education. We've got aging parents, so let's factor in some funding for that. We might want to go to Europe every year. They've actually worked out, well, how much is enough. And when you do that calculation, often the surplus wealth is a surprise. So then the letting go becomes a bit easier. And then obviously a key part of that equation is how much the kids need. And you've probably heard Warren Buffett's quote on this: leave enough to your kids to do anything in life, but not enough to do nothing. It's classic Buffett, wise, concise. But then of course, what does that mean? I mean, how much is that? And again, there's no right and wrong answer. Where I've landed, I've had lots of conversations on this issue: how much do the kids need? Because we know we get our self-esteem from our achievements in life, from having a crack at things, from failing, falling over, dusting ourselves off, and then going again, and hopefully having some sort of success, however we define that. That's how we build our self-esteem. So kids, the next generation, they need to learn to work. And if they're, in my view, if they're being gifted significant assets or income streams, I'm not sure that's often. Sometimes that's managed. I've seen that cases where that's managed really well. I've seen a lot more cases where that hasn't been managed well. So where I've landed, and there's no right and wrong answer with this, James, where I've landed in terms of how much do the kids need is a small house. So that means they've got no rent, no mortgage. That's a huge head start in life, but they still need to get up out of bed in the morning to put food on the table, to build careers and maybe families. So it's a delicate issue, but that's where I've landed, a small house.
And if you were to think back about those 100 or so foundations that you help families create, and again, as you say, every family is different, but if you were to sit back, and your book is quite instructional as well as informative, if someone was thinking, well, how do I start? What are some of and you talked about passion and perhaps choosing one or two areas where the family's really passionate, but if you were to just take 2 steps back and say, I'm thinking about creating a foundation, we've got capacity as a family to do that, where do I start? And just some of the sort of rules of thumb.
Well, it's like if you're getting tax advice, you need to go and speak to an expert, and there are a number of nuances in the philanthropic sector. Do we need a structure? Maybe we do, maybe we don't, depending on what the family's trying to achieve. If the conclusion is yes, we need a structure, and again, every case is different. I've tend to find in my experience, James, if there's a philanthropic structure, it tends to bring more strategy, which tends to maximise the impact. You don't need a structure, but in my experience, it maximises the impact. And then if you're thinking based on what the family wants to achieve, the family unit, you've got to work out what type of structure is best for us, what quantum are we going to, what will the initial gift be? And then it's delving into what are the family values, what excites us about the world, what upsets us about the world. It's getting families around the table together. And if there's a mum and dad and 2 or 3 or 4 kids, but you've got some very different views around the table. So, I mean, I've worked with a number of families where actually workshopping with them, what are you as a collective unit? What are you passionate about? So again, as we talked about earlier, ideally bring that down to 2 or maybe 3. If you can't get it down to 2 areas, maybe it's 3, but preferably not any higher than that. And then the first 5 years of your giving strategy, work out who's doing the best work in those 2 or 3 areas.
And then thinking about that generation, the younger generation, whether it's generation 2, 3 or 4, if they're listening to this conversation, or maybe they've read about philanthropy and they have perhaps more interest in the giving than perhaps their older generations, because the older generations were in the process of building the wealth for the family. What would be the 1 or 2 messages you'd say to the younger generation to be able to start a conversation with the family? Yeah,
well, I think it's having frank conversations with mum and dad. We sometimes the kids will know the full picture of the family wealth, and sometimes they won't, but they'll know whether there's some surplus wealth, and that's terrific, mum and dad, that's great, and we've had a privileged life. Perhaps we should share a bit more of that than we're doing, and imagine the satisfaction we could have as a collective unit, mum and dad and the 2 or 3 kids working together on the foundation and their 2 or 3 focus areas. I mean, it's incredibly satisfying, and I'm often saying to high net worth families, I mean, you just got to have one of those, because the American author Bill Perkins wrote a book called Die with Zero. His sort of premise really was, life shouldn't be about creating wealth. It should be about creating life experiences. And in my view, one of the best sort of life experiences you can have as a collective family unit is, yes, the family holidays are amazing, but they're there for a week, working on a foundation together for 5, 10, 20 years is incredibly rewarding. And the conversations around the table are very unique. And just with that in mind, if you could perhaps share with us the most rewarding experience that you had with a family with regards to setting up a foundation, and just what were the learnings perhaps for you that you took away as an advisor to the family, to say, well, this was an experience that not only was a growth experience for you, but was also an amazing experience for the family. There may not be one, but I'm just interested if there's a lot of learnings from you. That's really interesting, James. Because I'm not sure I could nail one, but multiple occasions I've worked with families and run something like a philanthropic vision workshop, and mum and or dad have run the next day or within a couple of days and said, that's one of the best family conversations we've ever had. Yeah. Because there's an independent person in the room for a start, so the kid squabbling disappears straight away, but it's just having this sort of a high level conversation. We're not talking about the footy or the cricket. We're talking about, there's a little bit of surplus wealth here. We've worked really hard to build a business and sell it, whatever, but there's been some luck along the way. Perhaps we could share some of them and so just incredible conversations which weren't happening. And then I can answer your question directly, James. There was many years ago, mum and dad set up a foundation. There were 4 kids. And dad was a terrific guy, self-made. Mum was very successful. And they really understood early on in the journey that they were going to run the foundation themselves as mum and dad. And they thought, oh, yeah, Peter, that's interesting. Let's get the kids engaged. And they went through the whole process of getting the kids engaged, teaching them about investment strategies, working through the philanthropic vision. I helped them with that. And then about the 2nd or 3rd board meeting, and Dad was a very strong character. 2nd or 3rd board meeting, there was a debate between 2 of the children, and I always sat in a position where you could see everybody and watch the faces and the eyes to see what's going on in the room. And I was watching Dad. He's about to lean into the debate. He leaned back. He took off his glasses, put them on the table, sat back with and just watched the debate between his kids with a smile on his face. And I thought, he's so impressed with what's going on with the family. So that's probably a long-winded answer. But that's a great example. And I was actually going to say, in addition to that, if there was perhaps, even if it's to get the conversation started, if you had some parting views for advisors in terms of
how do you start a conversation with a family without telling them what to do?
Yeah. Well, you're right. You can't tell them what to do. I mean, no one wants that, particularly self-made, successful families. And the advisors are really important, but the lawyers, the accountants, the wealth advisors, because often, they're the gatekeepers. And often, James, again, because the immaturity of the philanthropic sector, often they're not skilled up on, I don't really know what a private ancillary fund is. I don't really know what a public ancillary fund, sub-fund is. So sometimes they're a bit loath to raise these. But I think they've got a really important role in terms of growing the philanthropic sector. And, there's lots of evidence of when the wealth creators pass, the business is lost to the wealth advisor because they hadn't built a relationship with the next generation. Well, one of the best ways to build a close relationship with the next generation is to be raising issues such as philanthropic structures the family might want to get engaged with, which the family will have a great experience with, hopefully. And then the advisor will be managing the money, and they're not losing funds on a manager, they're managing the money within the foundation. And so they're meeting the kids, the next generation, and if they're smart enough, they can work out a way to stay in the room when some of the other conversations are being held around what are we going to do, what's our strategy here with our giving. So I'm always encouraging advisors to get engaged. It's a great way of client retention, if nothing else.
Yeah, and perhaps to finish off, you talked in your book about the culture in Australia, and indeed the philanthropic industry is quite unchanged, and you touched on it a few times, saying it's immature.
Yeah.
In your mind's eye, what needs to, if anything, needs to change in Australia to sort of give the sector a bit more of a
I think, James, bodies such as Philanthropy Australia are often talking about we need structural change. There's been a lot of structural change in the philanthropic sector in the last 2 decades, such as the introduction of private ancillary funds and other issues, which has meant we really don't have any excuses to grow our levels of giving amongst high net worth families. It's cultural change we need. We need influential high net worth families in every state and territory to give at higher levels and then talk about it. And that's a difficult issue in Australia, because if you're giving material sums, often families don't want to talk publicly about that for a whole range of reasons. They think they're going to look like a toss-up because people are going to think I'm big noting or I'm private. I just want to get on with the job, create some change. Or other people aren't talking about it. So why would I? So if the tall poppy syndrome is alive and well in Australia, I don't quite understand the tall poppy syndrome, but I think something like an Australian giving pledge, where influential high net worth families are publicly committing to giving away something like a minimum of 20% of their wealth in their lifetime or upon their death. That would have significant cultural change around the country if we had these role models. I think that will come. Very dangerous to compare ourselves to the States. Very different countries for lots of them. They've had generations of wealth. Some reasons the Americans are better celebrating success than we are, and they don't have the order of Australia. So one of their ways, I guess, to being frank, to climb the social ladder is to give and talk about it. We're a bit different. We come from more of the British system where let's ask government to provide. The Americans have a disdain for governments getting involved in their life. I think that's shifting here as well, but it's the cultural change that we need. And I'm very optimistic that will come. It's weight of money. More and more, I see more and more families thinking around, what are we going to do? We've created this wealth. What are we going to do? How much is enough? As we already talked about, how much is enough and how much do kids need? I'm seeing more families thinking through that. And then the weight of money that I think the philanthropic sector will explode in Australia in the next 2 decades.
I hope so. Well, Peter, lovely to have a chat. And on behalf of Providence, thank you very much for coming in to have a conversation with us.
Yeah.
For those that are interested in the wealth, in the philanthropic space, I strongly encourage you to read Peter's book, Give While You Live. And here at Providence, we're more than happy to have a conversation with anyone that is interested in learning more about the philanthropic space. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, James.
Whilst there are many things to consider with regards to philanthropic intent, here are some practical starting points for you to consider. Have a conversation with the family to understand your intent and allow everyone to have a voice. Seek advice regarding the most appropriate structure for your giving. Understand what capacity you genuinely have to allocate to philanthropic endeavours. Determine who will manage the investments within your foundation on your behalf. Ensure that you create a structure around your family's approach with regular meetings, who will be involved within the family and who will take the lead. Ensure you have detailed notes for support. And also make sure you have buy-in from all family members. And also give consideration to the tenure of the giving for each charitable intent. Here at Providence, we'd be more than delighted to have a conversation with your family to help you on the pathway to a more charitable giving intent.